Hello. This tutorial is designed to give you some steps for sewing a mask out of knit fabric. My name is Sarah. I'm known as Sarah Pomegranate on social media, and I host the Yarns at Yin Hu podcast. I began sewing a lot of woven fabric masks for family and friends, but I was thinking about a mask that would be a little more comfortable to wear over longer periods of time. Most of the patterns for a fitted mask that's sewn are for woven fabrics. And most of the tutorials I found online that featured a knit fabric were a no-sew variety of mask. So I started to do a little bit of experimenting to see if I could sew a mask from knit fabric without using any serger or super fancy stitches on my sewing machine. Let me give this a try. Some of the features of this mask are that it's double-sided, so there's an inside and an outside, which is really important if you happen to take it off and want to put it back on. It has elastic at the ears. It has a little pocket for a nose wire. And there's an opening in the bottom in case you want to insert another kind of filter or a piece of HEPA filter or something like that. It's very important to note that this is not a surgical or medical quality mask. It's designed specifically for personal use. The first step is to cut your knit fabric. One of the qualities of knit fabric, you can see it here, is that it wants to roll. So I found it really helpful to cut a piece of oak tag or folder in the dimensions of the mask and then hold that down over the fabric while I cut around it with my rotary cutter. And this helped prevent the rolling. I could also cut 2 layers of fabric at once, but I should add that it's not essential that you have square corners or straight lines in any of this sewing because one of the features of knit fabric is that it's very forgiving. So if your fabric isn't exactly the same size, it's a little wonky, it's okay. If your knit fabric stretches more in one direction than the other, that stretch should become the long or horizontal edge of your fabric. It's also important to consider at this point, if you're using a fabric with a directional print, you'll want to take note of that when you do the next step, because one of the edges of your fabric will be the bottom edge, and you need to identify that now. Take the bottom edge of your fabric. You can see here that I have these little flowers and I want them to be oriented up toward my eyes. So I've selected this edge as the bottom edge of my fabric. So I fold it about a 1/2 inch to the wrong side, press, and then sew a seam. I have a stretch stitch for knits on my machine, and I did use that feature for a couple of these seams, but I have to say it's not essential. You could use a regular stitch or a zigzag stitch for sewing knit fabric. You can experiment a little bit with your machine. The next step is to make marks 2 inches from the top and bottom edge of your fabric. Both pieces of fabric, both sides. And I just marked this on my template so that it would be easy to locate and do on a bunch of masks in a row. Fold each piece of fabric in half lengthwise, like hot dog style, right sides together, and press. Then, using those points you marked at 2 inches from the top edge and bottom edge on each piece of fabric, pull those up to the center so you have a fold in the middle and press. Here you can see I've now pinned those places that I pressed down. And I'm going to sew with a basting stitch just to secure that fold into place. So I used a longer, like 3 or 4 length basting stitch, and my seam allowance was about 1/8 of an inch. And I just sewed that down on each side of each of these pieces. Next, cut your elastic. I used 1/4 inch elastic that I cut to 6 1/4 inch lengths. It did take me a little bit of experimentation to figure out what would be the most appropriate length to get a good fit around my face. So you might want to go smaller or larger depending on the size of your face, the positioning of your ears. You could also start experimenting with cutting your fabric smaller or larger. I think the fabric for this mask will fit most adults. If you're going to make a child-size mask, I would not just shorten the elastic, but I would actually reduce the size of the fabric. It's very important to pin the elastic into place so that you don't sew it into a seam where you don't want it sewn. So here I've pinned my elastic to the right side of one piece. Then I take the ends, and it's helpful here to make sure that you don't have a twist in your elastic. So I took the ends and then I pinned them to the edges of the fabric at about 1/4 inch. Then I take my other piece of fabric and I sandwich that elastic in. Make sure your fabric is right sides together and make sure that you have both bottom edges aligned because you're creating that pocket there. You need the bottom edges to be lined up. So then I kind of unpinned and repinned in order to sandwich that elastic where I wanted it along the edge of the fabric. So here you can see if this would be my elastic hanging out here between the layers of my fabric. And now I've pinned all the way around the outside edge. You can see that I have these double pins. That is going to mark my start and stop points because I want to leave this pocket here. And the double pins help me to remember. I used a regular stitch to sew all the way around the outside of my mask. You can see it's a little crumpled and wonky. When I turn the mask right side out and tried it on, that doesn't really matter. So be really easy on yourself with this part. You could use a zigzag stitch if you wanted to. So you can see where I started and stopped. And then in order to secure the elastic a little bit better, I did use a back stitch in the portion where I was sewing over the elastic, and that makes it nice and secure. Snip all 4 corners, being careful not to cut into your seams. This will help you turn the mask and will give you like a little better edge in your finished product. Now turn your mask right side out so you can see how that fold created a little bit of a pocket and gives nice coverage. Remove the pins that were anchoring your elastic, and you can wear your mask like this. It stretches quite nicely across the bridge of your nose, and you don't need to add a nose wire to this mask to get a good fit. You may want to reduce the length of the elastic around your ears to get it to be a little more snug, or use one of those devices that you put across the back of your head and then hook your ear elastic into it, but you can get a nice fit. If you want to go the extra step of adding a nose wire, then turn your mask inside out again, and along the top edge, along this top seam here, trim down your seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch. It's most important to trim the seam allowance in the center. You can see that I left quite a bit of seam allowance on the outside here. Turn your mask right side out, and then use pins to mark where you will make the pocket for your nose wire. I marked about 2 inches in from each side of the mask. But you can adjust this depending on your preferences. If you've tried some masks, you may have a really good idea of what you want. I used a stretch stitch to sew a seam about between 1/4 and 1/2 an inch from the edge of the fabric, from pin to pin, to make a pocket. You could use a straight stitch, you could use a zigzag stitch here. Probably a straight or a stretch stitch would work best. I use floral wire for my nose wire. I cut a length that's just under the length of the pocket that I created. And then I tape the ends with masking tape because the floral wire wants to start unwinding very quickly, and it's very sharp. So I just use some masking tape to blunt the ends a little bit and make it easier to insert and more comfortable. Turn the mask inside out, and then very slowly and carefully insert that nose wire into the pocket you've created. It will probably want to catch on your knit fabric because it's very stretchy and it's easy to catch. So just go slowly and wiggle it in there. Then turn your mask right side out. And you can see how the nose wire is inserted inside that pocket where it's unlikely to irritate you. And you can fit it around the bridge of your nose. This creates a more secure fit. People who wear glasses also like to have this sometimes because you can fit the mask around the bridge of your nose and then set your glasses on top of the mask. And that helps to prevent some of the fogging effect that you get when you wear glasses and a mask at the same time. And then on the bottom edge, you have your pocket. So you could place a coffee filter, HEPA filter, or some sort of additional filter in there for added protection. Remember to remove your filter before washing, and if you're going to toss it in the machine, I would encourage you to remove the wire as well. I hand wash my masks, and so I don't remove any of the wires. It's advised that you treat your mask the same way you do your underwear, that you wash it after each use, especially if you're wearing it for several hours or more. Stay safe and stay well, and I hope this tutorial has helped you think about how you might create a mask out of knit fabric.